one thing that I do want to mention is that from now on, we will be recording the interventions. So if you don't want to be recorded video, you can turn off your video. If you don't mind, that's no issue. And with this, I would like to invite Philippe Gachon to say a few words for 5 minutes concerning his reaction to the work. Philippe, si tu veux commenter, c'est à ton tour.
Merci beaucoup, Frédéric. Merci, Vicky. Merci pour l'invitation. It's a really pleasure first to see you, Vicky, and the rest of the colleagues, because I think you talk about this 15 or 17 years ago when we worked together at Uranus, when I was a research scientist at Environnement Canada, and I know that you have worked a lot to do this kind of book. First comment, souvent on dit que le Canada a beaucoup de géographie et pas beaucoup d'histoire. Alors, Vicky, tu viens de faire mentir en partie cet adage. The history and also the history about the climate also strongly linked with the discovery of Canada for sure, but this has a strictly an important aspect to consider as soon as we know the climate that we have in Canada, but also the importance of the climate to stay here, but also to be sure that it's also part of our history. Et merci beaucoup pour ça, ne serait-ce que pour ça aussi, Vicky, en dehors du travail que tu as fait, c'est de rendre hommage non seulement à tous ces personnes aussi qui ont marqué l'histoire, mais aussi l'histoire du climat et aussi l'histoire de notre capacité collective à avoir une mémoire de la climatologie, et aussi une mémoire en fait de cette possibilité qu'on a eue grâce à ces personnes-là que tu décris très bien d'ailleurs dans le livre, de pouvoir observer et témoigner aussi de ce qui se produisait, de ce qui s'est produit ici en termes d'évolution du climat au Canada. Je vais tout de suite faire une remarque parce que je ne peux pas m'empêcher, je suis prof, et que on va s'en reparler, Vicky, puis peut-être aussi avec Frédéric. Définitivement, moi, c'est un livre que je recommanderais à mes étudiants dans mon cours de climatologie. Et pour augmenter la capacité, évidemment, de pouvoir se faire connaître, ce serait formidable que ce livre soit disponible aussi en français. Voilà. Donc, c'est un message que je nous lance à tous les trois. On va travailler ensemble pour que ça devienne une réalité. Mais il y a tellement de choses très intéressantes là-dedans. En fait, oui, c'est un hommage à la climatologie, mais c'est aussi un hommage à tous ces gens qui ont travaillé aussi très fort pour que l'observation devienne une réalité dans des conditions qui étaient loin d'être évidentes. On est loin de l'Europe, oui, il y avait quand même une certaine capacité à observer des choses avec des instruments et des choses qui venaient d'ailleurs, mais il n'y avait pas la mémoire collective, notamment du passé, et quand je lis d'ailleurs ton document, Simon, cette culture, j'ai lu, parce que je l'ai eu quand j'étais évidemment aux études, un livre qui m'a fait d'ailleurs penser au tien, l'histoire du climat depuis l'an 1000, d'Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, qui reconstitue justement l'histoire du climat en Europe à partir des dates de vendange. Donc c'est aussi une façon de pouvoir reconstituer l'histoire du climat, évidemment, de voir comment la végétation et comment l'agriculture en général est affectée évidemment par la climatologie. Mais cette difficulté-là, en fait, qu'ont eu les observateurs, et qu'ils soient français ou anglais, à s'assurer encore une fois que non seulement ils prennent des écrits dans tout ça, mais qu'il y a des choses qui restent. Je pense que aussi, et tu as très bien fait là-dessus, Vicky, tu leur rends hommage. Et c'est vraiment important. Moi, personnellement, j'ai appris beaucoup de choses en lisant ton livre. Mais c'est un hommage aussi à toutes ces personnes aussi qui ont marqué, oui, l'histoire, mais aussi notre capacité, encore une fois, à se rappeler comme tu disais tout à l'heure en introduction, que le climat, c'est de toute façon, à toutes les échelles de temps, loin d'être stable, et encore moins stable, évidemment, à l'échelle canadienne, puisqu'on a des saisons extrêmement marquées. Je terminerai pour dire que je vais te lancer des questions tout à l'heure parce que j'en ai plusieurs qui me viennent à l'esprit. Tu parles aussi, et ça c'est extrêmement important, on a l'un des plus aussi anciens services météorologiques dans les pays développés, service météorologique du Canada. C'est important d'ailleurs, tu le mentionnes ici, tu as consacré un chapitre là-dessus. Je pense que c'était aussi important de le mentionner. Et peut-être qu'on va en reparler tout à l'heure, Vicky, mais malgré tout, en fait, tu as eu quand même un peu aussi de collaboration de la part de collègues et d'ailleurs Environnement Canada qui ont cru en toi, mais aussi il y a des collègues à l'étranger qui ont cru en toi et je sais très bien de qui il s'agit, notamment Phil Jones qu'on connaît ensemble, qui ont cru aussi à cette importance de reconstituer, de garder la mémoire de non seulement du climat, mais de son évolution dans le temps, parce que comme tu le disais aussi tout à l'heure, pour savoir où on s'en va, il faut savoir d'où on vient, et le climat fait partie de cette histoire-là. Voilà, je termine là-dessus, mais merci beaucoup, Vicky.
Merci, Philippe. Maintenant, je laisse la parole à Ali Nazemi. Ali? You're muted, so you may want to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Professor Fabry. Thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you very much, other colleagues in the panel. Vicky, I read your book. You know, I am an engineer, so I tried to approach your book doing my due diligence, engineering due diligence. So I, in fact, read your book twice. Once it was in March when we supposed to have this, and it was canceled, and one, in fact, yesterday. So it was a great opportunity reading your book for a few reasons. First of all, I guess that was a great work of authorship, and I would like to congratulate you for this because for a few reasons. First of all, I guess you gave a very good historical context to where meteorology and hydroclimatology in Canada start from. And maybe we don't recognize about the importance of this event. You know, I'm a naturalized Canadian. I'm not from here. I didn't born in Canada. But, you know, it's very obvious that this is a very eventful duration in Canada, both geopolitically, socioeconomically, and culturally. But also, if we look at the length of the data, length of the period that you try to look at, you know, that 128 years that you declared in the beginning in the preface of your book, comparing to the time that CMC is operating, you know, since 1841, which is around 1871, which is around 150 years, you cover 128 years. So it's almost similar period of time with much less data. And that is, I guess, very courageous effort. In terms of the depth of the work, you know, I did not have a point of reference. I have not encountered with any work before about that period, climate of that period in Canada. So I did not have a particular point of reference, but, you know, after reading a lot of books and papers and being in this business for a long time, I recognize that it was not only a great dedicated work, but also, I guess, that sense that some sentences you see in the book, that it means that you have a lot of thoughts, you give a lot of thoughts to those sentences to come out. And as I said, it was a great work of authorship. As an engineer and personal practitioner of hydroclimatology, I find it the importance of the book is giving a context, historical context. And I guess this would be a very valuable book for engineers to read and understand actually the pain that some of this data required to be obtained, and perhaps those data build up the first infrastructure that's run in this country. I'm sure this data has been used for various applications. You noted on some understanding the storms, you know, even for gardening, for botany, for various applications, transportation, all of these things that pave the way toward the country that we are now all sharing together. So these are fascinating stuff about your book. And knowing about these figures, I guess is very refreshing for a 21st century scientist, seeing that sincere devotion to science. I borrow this expression from your book, that we don't see this romanticism in science anymore. Our research is driven by research fundings and proposals and other stuff that perhaps is deviating us quite extensively from what actually science about, and this very genuine dedication to discovery of new things. So it was very refreshing. I definitely recommend your book to my graduate students to read. So that was the great parts in terms of the good points. The other thing that actually, I guess it was very important, and actually it gave me a lot of thoughts, perhaps for multiple weeks or perhaps, was the questions that we are still contemplating with, and the questions that our pioneers were contemplating with, and how much the questions and the challenges that we have are similar. One important issue is that our pioneers were observing weather, and they wanted to make conclusion about climate. These two are very different things. And still we are challenging with this. We are having this challenge. The data that we are getting in Toronto from 1840, or the data that we get from Montreal Pierre Trudeau Airport, they are our realization of weather, and how we can actually map now from understanding of the weather events to understanding of the climate patterns. This is a huge gap, and I guess our pioneers, to some extent, missing the point. I think there are two issues with our pioneers looking at the problem, two methodological and perhaps philosophical issue, and I wanted to actually ask you about this. That do you think that our pioneers have any recognition of the lag between any landscape change and the feedback that might have into the climate? Nowadays, by the science of land atmospheric impacts, we know that it always takes some resident time in order that a change in land surface basically start propagating its feedback into a climate system. So first of all, the question is is our pioneers in fact have this recognition, or whether they think that if I clear the forest this year, then next year I'm going to have a warmer weather. So that is something that in fact I couldn't find in your book, whether our pioneers really recognize this or misunderstood this, that there is a difference between, there is a lag between human impacts and the feedback into the climate. The other question that actually, I guess, is always the question of science, of hydroclimatology, even nowadays, is the question of a scale. And again, I was not understanding from the book that what was the real scale that these pioneers were looking at. I do understand that they were interested to the observation of the weather, but there are two questions here. Did they have any understanding of the natural variability? Perhaps not in the quantified way that we have it today, but did our pioneers in fact have any understanding that the weather in fact is changing through a cyclic way? Even we have stories in Old Testament that declaring the changes in weather at the time by Prophet Joseph that was seen in Egypt, and he had this dream about that. So did these are our pioneers, the people who name, and those great names in history, did these guys also have such recognition that perhaps what they are observing might be the subject of the natural climate variability? And the other thing is that sometimes in your book, especially when you discuss about Dr. Mann, he actually make very, very general statement about the human effect and observation with the past climate. And his opponent, what was his name? It was Barrington. He was also making a statement about 600, 700 years before the time that he was discussing. And at the time, they were looking at the temperature and pressure by scientific instruments, whereas these observations were coming perhaps from stories or paintings or other sources. How these guys were able to match these sources of knowledge together, I find it quite fascinating that these guys are measuring their own weather and then trying to match that with some perhaps much more qualitative information about the past, and then draw such fascinating conclusion and a strong conclusion. So with these questions, and again, thank you for your great book. I guess this was a great intellectual work. Congratulations for that.
Thank you very much, Ali. We're going to keep the questions, answering your questions after the third commentary. Et le troisième commentaire, Dustin Valen.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you everyone for the invitation to be here and to Victoria for this fascinating book. My own comments will focus less on the work itself and more on the importance of weather observation to a constellation of concerns related to a few things. One is the rise of a colonial scientific culture. We'll also talk about the imperial and racial overtones of this project, and ultimately its bearing on specific efforts to pioneer new methods of climate control. And this is a fairly new but growing area of study within the field of architectural history, of which you heard I am a part. Now, as Victoria rightly points out in the book, weather observation was about much more than simply taking stock of or complaining about the weather. Weather observation was part of a larger scientific effort to document all aspects of the natural world. This involved meteorologists, but also a large retinue of natural scientists, some of which have been mentioned already, people like botanists, geographers, geologists, zoologists, and of course, anthropologists as well, since there was a lot of interest in how people fit into this natural order of things. And these scientific elites were joined by countless amateur enthusiasts, something that is very much evidenced by this book as well. In reality, of course, every farmer, forester, civil servant, and entrepreneur was deeply interested in Canadian weather trends, including the possibility that longer-term climate change would help improve the Canadian landscape and ultimately the character of its society as well. Now, it's important to remember as well that observations about climate also reflected European cultural and economic interests at the time. Atmospheric recordings revealed how distant colonies could be of economic and strategic importance to the metropole, either by supplying the raw materials of progress or by absorbing Europe's excess population, unemployed, and other social ills. Now, this was especially true following an explosion in print media around the turn of the 19th century, so very much the heart of the book. Climate and weather observations appeared frequently in travel guides, gazetteers, and other promotional literature that was really designed to attract settlers and investment capital to British North America. Immigration, resource development, and economic expansion depended to a large extent on how European audiences perceived colonial geographies. And so it goes without saying that if you want to attract immigrants or tourists, you first need to convince them that social and economic opportunities existed in the physical landscape itself, with particular attention to things, many of which are mentioned in the book, things like shipping and transportation, the length of the growing season, and of course, extremes of temperature. There are also the problem of those prior experiences had taught European settlers to be slightly wary of promoters' claims. So in places like Australia, for example, where British settlers were promised a kind of agricultural paradise, and they showed up and discovered that the soil was too sandy to grow wheat and it was full of poisonous animals. So in the later kind of this promotional media, you really had to prove that a place was amenable to European interests. And so precise weather observations that were taken with scientific rigor and scientific instruments were really presented as a new form of immutable evidence, right? You couldn't contradict these things. They were quantitative, not qualitative, or so people believed at the time. So presented in the right light, weather observations proved that the colonies were amenable to European interests and even resembled, to an extent, the temperate environment of Northern Europe. And this is critical because Northern Europe was really a baseline against which all other geographies were judged and evaluated. Now, of course, there was also a racial dimension to this project. Colonial observers typically emphasized how settlers' physical, social, and economic well-being was contingent on features of the natural world, of which climate and weather are, of course, important parts. By including descriptions of a colony's physical geography alongside social commentary, these same writers helped naturalize colonial identities, right? They showed how cultural traits were produced in the characteristics of a geography itself. And this mattered a great deal because it meant that if your physical geography was unlike that of Northern Europe, it would also be a barrier to the development of European political and social institutions. Now, this is part of a very large debate that we now know as environmental or climate determinism, which Victoria also discusses in the book, but that really remains an understudied feature of imperial scientific culture. Debates over acclimatization and biological fixity that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, highlighted the interdependency of climate and civilization, as well as the difficulties of racial displacement all throughout the age of empire. Unlike temperate environments that were thought to be conducive to the so-called development of civilized races, threatening, insalubrious, or unproductive landscapes were associated with things like social instability, moral degeneration, and cultural racial hybridization. Climate data was thus frequently called on either to disparage local populations, as was often the case in places like Newfoundland, for example, or to show how environmental change and identity politics moved in lockstep, at least in theory. So to take an imperial worldview, weather observers weren't just recording atmospheric conditions, they were also searching for climates in which European social norms and other institutions could flourish. Now, the other key discussion that appears throughout the book relates to technology. The ability of weather observers to accurately measure atmospheric conditions depended to a large extent on the technology at their disposal. So thermometers, barometers, hygrometers, all of which appear in the book, of course. Here again, though, it's critical to situate these developments in terms of other industries and practices. Observing and interpreting the weather was, in essence, one half of this bigger imperial problem. Mitigating the adverse effects of allegedly dangerous climates was another challenge altogether. So in my own work, I'm interested in how a series of architectural technologies sprang up around the idea of climate control. Many of these technologies are also related to advances in the field of environmental medicine. And this is a field that is closely allied with racial anthropology and that also highlighted the dangers of climatic displacement. Physicians believed that some climates were healthy and others unhealthy, including and especially those that were excessively hot or cold, or where you had very pronounced seasonal changes. We can all relate to how that might be a problem in Canada, but also in the context of the Little Ice Age, right? The period of global cooling that extended from the 16th century all the way up to the 19th century. But it was really out of this fear, too, that a sustained interest grew in using artificial climates as a prophylactic against the harmful effects of natural ones. So consequently, we see, for example, at the beginning of the 19th century, devices like air and vapor baths becoming extremely popular. Imagine a kind of steampunk sauna. These were medical devices that were used to cure and fortify a patient's health by passing hot or cold air over their body, right? They allowed individuals now to create climates that were tailored to their specific wants and needs and deliver these localized forms of atmospheric medicine. So in a way, you could think of it as kind of inverting the idea of weather observation. It's no longer enough just to kind of hypothesize climate change. You need to find ways to actually enact that change at a different scale as well. But here again, though, we see climate change presented as a positive force, which is something we're not quite used to nowadays. One small detail in the book that immediately kind of popped out to me. It's a reference on page 90, in case anyone's keeping track, to Canadians being like hothouse plants. This was a very common expression actually in the 19th century, and it pointed to two important things. One was the incredible popularity of greenhouses at this time, and greenhouses were unique in that they allowed individuals to experience, often for the first time, a fully climate-controlled interior, right? The second was the belief that, like hothouse plants, delicate European bodies needed to be protected from climates that were either too hot or too cold. So much like the elaborate weather stations, standards, and nomenclature that Victoria describes in her book, that made weather trends knowable and communicable. Climate control made weather as much a product of industrial modernity as it was a part of nature. For me, this is probably the most interesting aspect of the book. I think I'm probably over time, so I'll stop there and we can continue in the discussion that follows.
Thank you very much, Dustin. So I've noted a couple of dimensions of discussion. One is more on the scientific dimension, such as lag between cause and effect, scale, and discussions of past climates. And the other one is about the imperial worldview and how the climate and weather enterprises enter into this. So Vicky, maybe you want to comment on some of the questions that Ali raised first?
Sure. So on the scientific idea of natural variability, that I found that very interesting because they brought up a lot of issues about natural variability. I don't think they expected it to have an instant effect. Like as you mentioned, I don't think they expected to cut down the tree today and next year it will change. But Mann, for instance, when he was talking about the Roman period, and he was quoting a lot of the Roman writers. I looked up the dates of the Roman writers, like their dates of birth and the date that they're writing. And the first part of his treatise covers 1,000 years. So he's taking these references anytime between 6 BC and 4 AD, and so he's just sort of lumping them all together, like the Roman period, which covers a huge range of time. He's referring to the cold periods, and I think Barrington too, and Williamson to a certain extent, and they're just referring to the classical period, and they don't seem to be differentiating there. They're just taking this whole period. But then in the second part, when he starts talking about the Justinian period, and he starts talking about the cold winters, there he starts putting them into years, and he starts differentiating them, and he's looking for cycles. And he starts looking for cycles of cold years, because this was not long after the very cold year of, there was 1608 was a cold year, and then there's another cold year, which I should know this, but I don't, 1689, I think. Anyway, so he was looking to see if those cold years were colder than the ones in the past. And so he was looking. So that was interesting to me. Like on the one hand, he's using these evidences, but without putting them in time. And then afterwards, he is putting them in time. So what is their view of time? How are they placing this? How are they thinking about variability? But on the whole, they did not seem to be thinking about natural variability in cycles. At the 18th century anyway, they seem to be thinking about it in terms of a gradual progression, like the Earth was cooling since its formation because it was losing heat. So that was actually, well, this is a whole digression, but they're trying to calculate the age of the Earth based on the heat of the formation and how much heat it lost in its formation. So the Earth could only be this many thousands of years old, because otherwise it would be, this was Fourier as well, and this was a whole other issue in the 19th century, especially. They were trying to find out the age of the Earth based on the heat loss and things like that. So they were thinking mostly in terms of very long-term trends. And then Mann was one of the first to start thinking about cycles. Were there cycles in cold winters, for example? So that was one of the first and only people I found who thought about natural variability in terms of cycles. In terms of the change of landscape, I mean, there were massive deforestation going on in North America at the time. I don't know if we have any way of reconstructing that. I know there are a lot of people working in biosolids and soil archaeology and things like that. I think they're starting to come up with some very interesting evidence of just how much fire and deforestation there was before European settlement too. So I think we're just starting to find out what the whole history of landscape was, even going back before European colonization, and it's a big unknown. So that's very interesting as well. But there was massive deforestation going on in Eastern North America. So I think they were thinking more very long term. I don't think they were thinking short term in that sense. But it is very interesting to try and, that's one of the things I found very interesting in the book, was to try and find out, try and put myself in their mental space. Like, this was before germ theory. This was, some of it was before Lavoisier. It's very, for me anyway, it's quite hard. Like, what exactly was phlogiston? How were they thinking about it? What were their scientific references? So that's interesting. And at the same time, yes, they were using a lot of different things together, but then we do too. We use tree rings and ice cores. And that is actually one of the criticisms that goes on now, is when people mix up thermometer records with tree ring records. And that's not, so we do that too a little bit. These multi-proxy records that use lots of different types of indices. So again, that's something that can still be criticized today, of mixing different types of things together. So the answer, it's not completely clear, but I think some of them were more precise and scientific than others. Some of them were definitely very hand-wavy and promotional. As Dustin said, Williamson was definitely very promotional. You know, we'll create a wonderful climate here and everything will be beautiful. And some of them were a lot more skeptical. So it depends really on the individual. There isn't one answer that fits all. The individuals there was definitely a battle of ideas, and individual people were more skeptical or more optimistic. It was not a uniform way of thinking. For the empire, well, that's what was kind of interesting. Why I did not get into it too much is there was a lot of what Dustin said I found in the secondary literature. And of course, you have people like Ellsworth Huntington, is very well known for the climatic determinism. I did not find so much of that in the source documents for the people I was researching here. I know Suzanne Zellers, for example, she discussed that a lot in her book, Inventing Canada. I decided not to get into that too much because I was thinking more along the lines of the scientific, and there's more than enough with the scientific arguments. I was surprised not to find a little bit more of that with the medical side. I thought there might have been more with that. The hothouse plants was actually a sneer at Canadians because it was John Lambert who was coming to do some exploitation from the UK, and his argument was like, oh, the Europeans are really tough and they don't need these stoves. These Canadians with their stoves and their indoor heating, you know. So he was more sneering at the Canadians for heating their houses because the English don't need to heat their houses. I have English relatives and I can confirm that. The English summer is very cold compared to the Canadian summer. So yeah, that was kind of interesting to see the recent European immigrant versus the acclimatized Canadian point of view there for the hothouse plant. So definitely that aspect of empire was a part of it, and there was more of that, I think, in the French literature later on in the 19th century, and maybe later on in the 18th century, especially in the Caribbean, and I do have some references, which I have not got around to yet because it wasn't really part of this book, about there's a lot of French medical weather observations and acclimatization there, but it's sort of I have enough to do and it was out of my scope. But I did not see a lot of that kind of discussion in Gautier in his writings, and I did not see a lot of it in Smallwood, and those are the two doctors who left most of their notes. So I did not see a lot of the kind of taking observations for imperial use. I did not come across that so much directly. I think there would have been some of that in the Toronto Observatory and in the in Lefroy's visit, his magnetic tour to the Northwest. That would have been more the sort of inventory science that Suzanne and sort of empire building. The Hudson Bay Company also is borderline on that. The Hudson Bay Company, they wanted people to take observations more so they could become self-sufficient, and so they wouldn't have to send all the supply ships, which was not exactly, well, it's resource exploitation in the sense that they were there for the furs in the first place. How the meteorological observations weren't exactly resource exploitation as much as they were facilitating the resource exploitation of the furs. So it's interesting in that that did happen, but I did not come across it directly in these sources. So it'd be very interesting to see if there are other sources where that's explicitly shown. And then that could be a really interesting line of work to see if there are more observations out there that could be used for that. Although another thing that I was thinking is, I don't know, is the military records, the Royal Engineers, for example, who kept weather observations, both for the engineering point of view and from the empire point of view. So.
This is perhaps where it might be important to think of the motivations of the people initiating and taking the measurements. And of course, then there would be the motivations of the people using these observations for other uses. And I guess I'm not too sure which, I could imagine scientists or curious people wanting to know the weather on their own, but I can also see other stakeholders being a lot more interested in promotion and therefore using those measurements, or perhaps even directing governments, perhaps like the Toronto office and all that, to collect more of these data for advertisement purposes or characterization purposes. Maybe it's a good time to open the floor. Ali, Dustin, if you want to say some more, you're certainly welcome, but I want to take advantage to broaden the question to the whole group. So if anybody wants to start.
Maybe I would like to ask to you, Vicky. According to the, I think it's a long time, a long process to do this kind of book, because you need to pass some time not only on record, but also to be sure that you have also on your hand certain amount of information. A quick question. What was the most difficult thing to do this kind of book? Because pretty sure it has taken more than 1 decade to do this. What the most difficult thing that you have to do according to different kind of source and information that you need to collect?
Well, you know a little, well, you know my history, Philippe. So I was working as a scientist, for those who are not aware of my history. I had a chronic illness. I had to stop working formally around 2003. So really this book came together as I was working. I was on disability leave, so I was at home and looking for something to do. So a lot of the sources I found are really, maybe not necessarily the best sources, but they were what I could find on the internet from home. So I suppose one of the difficult things to do was, as I did not necessarily have access to a university or to a library, was to make sure that sources I had were the best references. Actually, it's amazing what the BNAQ had and what they have available to citizens. I was able to find so much information just from, I wouldn't have been able to do this, say, 20 years ago. There's so much information out there now on the internet. So that was really interesting. The sources I found and what's in the book is really, I guess, what I came across. So there might be a lot of things that I should have come across or other things I should have checked, but I didn't have access to them, or there may be a lot of other things out there that maybe would have been better sources, but this is what I had to hand. I don't know, I found it all so interesting. I really enjoyed doing this. I guess there's a few things that were physically difficult, such as going, a lot of the letters, a lot of the documents I had to go and physically take pictures of because they were not digitized. So I would go to archives and take pictures of them with a camera. But that was also interesting. So trying to decipher the writing, some of the books, the letter book, especially from the Toronto Observatory, they were kind of the equivalent of carbon copies, but they were written with fountain pen. So maybe Dustin has seen this before, but they were, if you can imagine the blotting paper of a fountain pen, trying to read that was, and Gautier's letter from 1754, that had water or wine or something spilled all over it. It took me 10 years to decipher that letter. It was terrible handwriting, and 18th century French. I'm not sure. I still haven't deciphered the whole thing. So there's maybe some incredible climatological information there that has not been written. So I would say making sure that I had all the sources, or making sure, feeling that, and also going into history when it's not my field. So on climate and science and things like that, that's okay. But going into a field that was not mine and feeling that I don't have training for this. Dustin would probably read this and say, oh, she hasn't mentioned this, she hasn't mentioned that, there's this whole field. So trying to go into a field and that's not mine, that was also uncomfortable in the sense that I felt very, very much that I'm going into crossing a boundary, but it was fascinating reading too. It was so interesting to see all this happening. So.
Anybody else wants to ask something? So Vicky, how would you comment, I mean, in the context of using these observations for present day use, for example, for looking at past climates, etc., how would you qualify the quality of the data that was collected in the 18th and 19th century?
Well, the 18th century Gautier, there were definitely some big error bars around that just because the thermometers were still being developed. So things like the scale, they were still being invented. So the liquid that was being used, the scales, definitely we can't go and say, oh, we know that July 30th, 1945, it was exactly 15.58 degrees. I mean, no, we can't do that. Having said that, we can't say that July 30th, 2020 was 15.5, One of the questions is relative to what? Like how precise, how sure are we about the observations for today? So that's one question. Philippe talked about Phil Jones, for example, and one of the questions of using historical observations is it's still an instrument. It will still go up when the temperature is warm and down when the temperature is cold. So this is one of the things about using anomaly data is it's still going to, he said, Phil Jones's philosophy is even the cheapest instrument outside a farm door will still record relative temperature fluctuations. Of course, then the big problem is trying to get it, how do we put these relative fluctuations in context of everything else? How do we put these into the mass of all the other observations? And so we can see just how, we can see that Reimer's paper from 1733 is already talking about how do we make standardized observations? What are the what are the things we have to take into account? Not just direct radiation, but reflected radiation, for example, height of the thermometer. So as early as 1733, we're trying to come up with, Reimer and the scientists are trying to come up with standards to make observations intercomparable. That's a long time ago. People knew about these things for a long time. These are, I guess this is the thing, they were not stupid. They were very intelligent people trying to look at these things for a long time. So I'm trying to overcome these problems. And that's one of the things you can see when you look at these books. They knew about urban heat island effects. They knew about calibration issues. So they were very meticulous in taking these observations. So I don't think we can just say, oh, they're old observations, therefore they're rubbish, and let's just throw them out. I think we can use them, but use them cautiously. Like be aware of their limitations. But and there are some points where we just have to say no, we can't use them. So the Glackmeyer observations, there's one point where they were in the sun at noon. So okay, we know we can't use that because we know they were contaminated by solar radiation. So we just know those are not usable. But he's still a lot of information in his diary that is of use. Like the morning observations are probably okay. And all his observations about frost and rain and snow, I mean, those are all fine too. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to take everything that's in the diary, not to just go and grab the thermometer observations and leave everything else, because it's important to say, well, when it snowed, was it below zero? Well, was it below freezing? You know, when it rained. And this is the other thing, more generally speaking, about observations. In the past, a lot of campaigns to take observations would just take the observation somebody was interested in. So one campaign would go and take temperature. And then they would look at it and they would homogenize it and they would say, okay, well, we see there's a problem here, so we'll add 2 degrees to this thing and whatever. And then another campaign would go and take precipitation and say, oh, well, we think there's a problem here, so, you know, you need to adjust this. And then 20 years later, put them all back together, and you would find that it was snowing at 5 degrees Celsius, you know, or they would adjust it to add precipitation, and you'd find it's raining when there were no clouds or something like that. So it's really important to take the entire data set, which is what we're doing with DRAW, and look at it as a whole. You can't just take one piece of information like the temperature or the precipitation and look at it by itself. You need to look at it in the whole context of the observation. When I was starting off, and I was looking at pressure, and this is the big thing is how do we stitch them all together? How do we stitch various pieces of information together? And that's a process called what we call homogenization. Like how to take different records and say, okay, we want to compare them all so we can look for climate change. And the more I look at these records, the more I really think we should do as little, we have to do some quality control. And sometimes you can see an observer moved and there's a big break in the record. So yes, okay, there's a problem with the time series. But I think we really should do as little as we can to the series. There's some quality control we have to do, and there's some homogenization we have to do. But by and large, I think we should trust the observers as much as we can. Sometimes they knew, so sometimes they would say the correction is 0.2 degrees or something. But I'm starting to think more and more we need to sort of back off and trust the observation. and say, this is what it was. And either we trust it or we don't. If we don't trust it, why are we using it? So, yeah.
Thanks, Vicky. Anybody else wants to ask something?
I'd really like to hear Adi or Philippe's comments on that.
Philippe?
I would like to add something because it's an interesting point that you put forward. And I know that for sure it has taken some time for you and a huge amount of work that you have to do to correct this thing. But more generally, I'm pretty sure that a strong majority of people, they are not aware about the fact that we have record in Canada about meteorological condition and also climate condition. And it's for this kind of, and it's an important thing because it's come from the memory of the people here. But it's an important thing that we need to consider. The other thing, in other words, it's important that your book, Vicky, needs to be publicized across different universities, but also across Canada, because it's part of the history of Canada. We have also some record and also some climatologists who has been able to collect some information. First thing. The other important thing, according to the important also to develop the memory, to also be able for the following step also to combine this kind of collection data, meteorological condition with the other record that we have across Canada to continue to construct the memory, the history that I introduced in my first comment. It's really crucial because the memory is also a manner to say where we are in terms of citizen, in terms of scientists, but also to introduce the importance of the collection of important things that we need to consider to develop the intelligence, scientific intelligence, with different kind of background and also discipline. It's my comment that I would like to put forward, but it's one of the important aspects of the development of the memory from my point of view.
Ce que Philippe vient de dire me donne envie de donner la parole à Vicky pour qu'elle publicise encore mieux sur le travail de Sam qu'elle est en train de faire en ce moment.
OK. En anglais ou en français? I don't know how many English, anglais versus, je sais pas. OK, donc en fait, oui, on est en train de faire, il y a le projet SAM qu'on fait avec McGill. En fait, on réfléchit si on essaie de faire une organisation non gouvernementale, quelque chose comme ça, pour essayer d'aller plus en Canada, pour recueillir plus de données. Donc le projet SAM, c'est vraiment le projet McGill. C'est avec McGill, avec les données de McGill. Donc, si on veut aller plus loin, recueillir plus de données autour du Canada, on se demande comment faire une organisation pour faire ça. Et on essaie de réfléchir c'est quoi les moyens d'y aller en avant avec ça. Il y a aussi l'organisation ACRE. Donc, mondialement, worldwide, there's the ACRE organization that stands for Atmospheric Circulation and Reconstruction Over the Earth. Donc, moi, je suis le chapitre canadien, une personne. Donc ça aussi, on essaie de voir comment on peut faire plus au Canada. On pense qu'il y a environ quelque chose comme 100 millions d'observations à recueillir au Canada, historique. Donc, la question, c'est comment est-ce qu'on peut faire pour recueillir, pour faire des mini-SAM ailleurs, pour répliquer SAM dans des autres contextes universitaires. We know, for example, there's an observatory in Kingston. We know there is one in Nova Scotia. We know there was Royal Engineers, for example, they were in New Westminster in BC. There are all the Hudson Bay Company records. So that could be something that could be, because this is an internet project, we would very much like to see if we can set up projects like this in remote communities up north, where there might be records from the Hudson Bay Company, and then they could be paired with communities that are up north, where they could set up, well, they could look into their current climate and also look at the past climates by something similar to SAM, if we could get similar education resources. But you know, how do we multiply this? How do we get the resources? How do we get this? And I've also been trying to look into translating the book. I do not know how. If anybody has resources into how to do that, that would be great. It seems like I need to contact a publishing company in order to get, and they would get a translator. But I've tried emailing a few publishing companies and have not got a response. So if anybody knows any editors or publishing companies or anything, that would be wonderful to look into that. Because I've had several requests to have the book translated. So,
Ali, you wanted to ask something?
Well, I mean, I just wanted to just echo on what Philippe mentioned. I mean, translation is definitely one way, and it's definitely an effective way. But I guess even with the book that you have, you can actually have a very widespread Canadian promotion of your book, because I share the sentiment of Philippe. I guess this is very important that people have the recognition of importance of the climate. And in fact, human-induced climate change, it seems that the first meteorological question of this country, even in the back in time before it was known as Canada, was in fact this general question that in fact this human is able to change climate. Now we are looking at this question from a different perspective. It's a shift in the perspective, but the general question is the same. And I guess this should be recognized by the people, by the society, not only by scientists. Even for a scientist and engineer, this is really striking. I imagine for people of Canada would be giving a lot of perspective into looking at their past and this climate that we are now measuring by provincial, municipal, and federal government, as well as what was accumulated from the past. And I try to now put my engineering hat. You know, I don't think that this data that we have from the past can be an indicator of what was the climate in the past, because of the instrumentation difficulties, as well as the period of the data and all these challenges. But in fact, in your book, you noted on some very important events in your chapter 13, as well as the beginning of your book, for instance, that called the spell of 1859, that we have consistent measurements and you know, measurements that they justify each other across the St. Lawrence Valley. Those information can actually be used as event with which we can now really look at the current or future climate and see how much the frequency of these events gonna increase or decrease. That would be a very good signal, I mean, detection of the signal of the climate change, rather than looking at the mean or variances, because, you know, approaching this data using a statistical technique perhaps would be hugely uncertain because of the statistical limitations that this data have. However, if we get them as a revelation of an event that happened in the past and we have some certainty about that, I guess that can be very well incorporated into our engineering design nowadays. So the value of your work is tremendous from that aspect.
Well, two things. One is one of the reasons we want to get what we call sub-daily. I'm not interested in monthly means. I'm interested in the original observations, because I want the daily or I'm not even interested in daily mean. I want the original observation, because we want the sub-daily information so we can get the extreme events. So we can get and so that's one thing. The second thing is this information goes to NOAA's, goes to NOAA. It feeds into worldwide databases. So I'm not the only one doing this, as I mentioned. There are people around the world who do this. And then we pool our data together, and then it goes into reanalysis models. So I don't know if you know.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so do you know the 20th century reanalysis?
Yeah, yeah.
So that now goes back to 1806 in the experimental remote. And I think the paper just came out recently. It goes to 1835. I think that just got released on NOAA's 20CR site. So, so all this data that we're producing goes into the reanalysis models. And so that's how it can get produced into a, well, worldwide. But they have what Gil Campo calls the clouds of uncertainty, or the fog of uncertainty. So there are areas where we don't have enough observations, and Canada is one of them, to be able to make a good estimate. So this is one reason why we need the Canadian data, and we need to do this Canadian data uptake. But Montreal, not so much, because there's a lot of information in the eastern US, well, eastern North America, but certainly the further we get north and west, the more we need this information, because there's not enough, it's too sparse, the data is too sparse. So, so we're looking to see which records we need to analyze or rescue, which data rescue we need to do in priority in order to feed the reanalysis models in order to go further back in time. So, so we're working with the NOAA's group as well. So that's where a lot of the data rescue goes into, well, into other NOAA and also other kinds of models like this for uptake. To so it doesn't just stay here; it also goes into worldwide databases to inform other data products as well. And then we have right now I'm trying to work on data from York Factory, because there's a disconnect between what the 20CR produces and what GHC and homogenized data produces. And so we're trying to figure out, so now we need the original data to see why there's this disconnect between these various data products. So in these places like Northern Canada. So, so yeah, we need, and then these things can run analyses to find things like storms. And so we're always looking at the 20CR data, and then we're looking at the observation data to see what is the 20CR not picking up, how can we make 20CR better? I mean, there's a lot of back and forth between the us, the data rescue community, and the reanalysis community to make these products better.
Well, thank you very much, Vicky. And I think this is a good place to conclude this first seminar of the CRIEM. Merci beaucoup, Vicky, et merci aussi à Ali, Dustin et Philippe pour leur contribution, et à tout le monde.
Merci à Frédéric aussi.
Donc, je tire mon chapeau. Et sur ce, à la prochaine. Merci.
Merci, à bientôt. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion.
So, Vicky, I have to do a small objection. The McGill Observatory was until 1991. I know I was one of the last observers.
Okay, sorry. With the radar observatory, yes.
No, but actually fit weather observations on campus.
That's true.
Until 1991 or 92.
Yes.
That's when we got.
I was thinking of this. Yes, you're right. You should have.
It was not an important issue. Dustin, you want to say something, or Caroline?
C'était beau pour moi, je vous remercie. Très intéressant cette conversation. Merci à tous.
Merci, Caroline.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Yes, thank you very much, Victoria. I would just add, too, I don't think you need to apologize for not being an historian. I think many bits of the history that you've reconstructed here are done with such a fine tooth that it's actually extremely interesting and admirable. So you're being inducted as an historian now, I think.